Chichen Itza, Mexico, 1842. An American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens wanders the empty ruins, looking for clues. He knows what he wants to find. It has kept him going through 2 harrowing journeys, exploring the desolate jungles of Central America. Kept him pushing on through mud and malaria, poisonous snakes, and insect-plagued nights under the stars. Stephens, the lawyer, was looking for proof, undeniable evidence that these ruins were not built by the Egyptians or the Phoenicians or the lost tribes of Israel. And here at Chichen Itza, he thinks that he's found it at last. Writing unlike that of any other civilization he knows. The same writing he'd seen at other ruined cities, hundreds of miles away. Proof of an ancient empire of Native Americans, more sophisticated than anyone believed possible. Stephens himself was a product of the New World. He was born in 1805, the son of a wealthy New York merchant. The city wasn't much more than a Dutch village, but it was the hub of a new nation. Stephens grew up along the Hudson River, watching the ships come in from around the world. After reading law, he opened a practice on Wall Street. Soon he got into politics, campaigning vigorously for Andrew Jackson for president. But months of shouting to the crowds gave him a serious throat infection. His doctor prescribed a common remedy for wealthy young men, a grand tour of Europe. The ancient ruins of Italy and Greece only piqued his curiosity. Stephens went on to Egypt and spent 3 months floating up the Nile, visiting the temples and monuments along the way. Only a decade before, a Frenchman had deciphered the hieroglyphs, revealing the rich history of Egypt's kings and queens. Stephens was fascinated, and he still wasn't ready to go home. He'd seen pictures of a fantastic ancient city in Arabia, lost for centuries to all but the Bedouins. Everyone told him the journey was too perilous for an unaccompanied American. So Stephens disguised himself as a Turkish merchant and took the name Abdel Hassis. In 1836, John Lloyd Stephens was the first American to set eyes on the ruins of Petra. In Roman times, it had been one of the greatest cities of the East. Stephens still found it dazzling.
A temple, delicate and limpid, carved like a cameo from a solid mountain wall. The first view of that superb facade must produce an effect which will never pass away.
Stephens' letters home were so vivid and imaginative, they were published in a monthly magazine. Soon, he was writing books recounting his exotic adventures around the world. The lawyer had become a literary sensation.
He was a seasoned observer. He was an incredible observer. In fact, Herman Melville of Moby Dick fame recalled one time when he was in church, Herman Melville was, he was a kid. He had heard that Stevens was in the front row. And when Stevens left, Melville writes, I thought this man must have great huge eyes that bulged from his head. He was such a good observer because Melville had read his stuff.
Back in New York, the life of a sedentary lawyer no longer held any charm for Stevens. Instead, his mind was filled with thoughts of another journey. Not so far away, but even more remote and daring. On his way home through London, he'd met an artist named Frederick Catherwood, who'd spent 10 years in the Near East. They shared their interests in exotic travel. Sensing a kindred spirit, Catherwood had showed him a curious book about a lost city in Central America, hidden in the jungle. The book's authors thought the fabulous ruins of Palenque had been built by Egyptians, Carthaginians, maybe even the lost tribes of Israel. Anyone but the Native Americans.
There was kind of a racism in here that said that everything great had come through the Greeks and the Egyptians, through the European tradition, and anything different appeared in relatively to be a bunch of naked savages wandering through the woods.
In 1839, no one believed the Native Americans capable of building a sophisticated civilization. Stevens' own government had little use for them. Only a year earlier, they'd uprooted thousands of Indians, sending them westward along the infamous Trail of Tears. The thought of a great ancient civilization in Central America seemed even more preposterous. A few travelers had reported sighting ruined cities like Palenque, but Stevens could find none of them on the map. It was a travel writer's dream. Only this time, he'd have to bring back evidence of whatever he found. But who better to accompany him than the artist Frederick Catherwood, now practicing architecture in New York? Only one small problem remained. The newly formed Central American Federation was fighting a bitter civil war. Using his political connections, Stevens secured a post as a confidential agent. He figured his diplomatic coat would protect them in dangerous territory. So in October 1839, Catherwood had bid farewell to his wife and 2 young boys. And now they were here, deep in the jungles of Central America. The ruins of Copan was their first goal. But when they found the little village with the same name, no one there had ever heard of nearby ruins. Finally, a knowledgeable Indian offered to guide them. But that was hours ago. Now they were beginning to think that the ruins were nothing but a legend. When suddenly, there they were, grander than their wildest dreams. The ruins of Copan. Pyramids rose majestically out of the jungle. Great stone faces peered at them from intricately carved monuments twice the size of a man. Stevens noticed hieroglyphs and judged them to be as fine as any he'd seen in Egypt. Yet his experience told him that these carvings were unique. The silence of the once majestic city overwhelmed him.
Copan lay before us like a shattered bark in the midst of the ocean, her masts gone, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came.
I think the description of Copan is the single most poetic description of a place he visits, for it is though he is walking around inside the Titanic, and he's looking at the shipwreck of a civilization. He walks from monument to monument, and it's as though he's looking into the faces of those who have recently been ruling this place.
America, say historians, was peopled by savages. But savages never reared these structures. Savages never carved these stones. Architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellished life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. And yet none knew that such things had been, or could tell of their past existence.
He's the first who really is able to say, look at these stone figures, these must be portraits of their kings and queens. And he uses the word queen, which is really quite astonishing in seeing men and women in the monuments for 100 years later. All the men and women that Stevens saw will have been reduced by 20th century archaeologists to a group of anonymous calendar priests. Stevens has this kind of Yankee can-do observation, and the best part of many of Stevens' insights is that they prove to be absolutely true.
Yet Stevens was deeply puzzled by the mystery at the heart of Copan. Who could have built this extraordinary city? The local Indians didn't seem to know. Stevens needed their help to explore the ruins, but the owner of the land interfered. Finally, it seemed that the only solution was to buy Copan. So the lawyer put on his diplomatic coat and went to the village to negotiate.
You are perhaps curious to know how old ruins sell in Central America. I paid $50 for Copan. There was never any difficulty about price. I offered that sum, for which Don Jose Maria thought me only a fool. If I had offered more, he would probably have considered me something worse.
Ownership settled, the team set about surveying the ruined city, measuring and mapping its buildings.
Catherwood is a remarkable character as well. I wish we knew more about him. One gains some sense of the Stevens personality just from the written word. The Catherwood personality doesn't emerge much. Stevens treats him very formally, and he appears as Mr. Catherwood.
At first, Mr. Catherwood found it almost impossible to draw the monuments. Their tropical luxuriance defied his restrained British hand.
Stevens mentions coming upon him in the woods one day. Catherwood standing in front of a big upright monument. It's a statue of one of the Copan rulers, and all intricately carved, and Catherwood standing there almost obscured by a pile of crumpled paper, which represents the output so far that day of unsuccessful attempts to draw this thing.
Fortunately, Catherwood had brought along a camera lucida, a box with a prism inside, which allowed him to trace a reflected image. To please the perfectionist Mr. Catherwood, every detail had to be correct.